In 3.5 years, President Biden has already installed more non white federal judges than any president in history. His slate of judges is also majority female, another first. As Biden and former President Donald Trump barrel towards a fall rematch, the Washington Post is examining the numbers behind their time as presidents. In this case, they reviewed the approaches to nominating federal judges who enjoy lifetime tenure once confirmed by the Senate. Now, across the Supreme Court, Circuit, and District Court, 65% of Donald Trump's appointments are white men, while just 13% of Biden's Senate confirmed appointments so far are white men. And prosecutors rested their case against Donald Trump today after another dramatic day of testimony from his former lawyer, Michael Cohen, who admitted that he conned Trump and his company out of money while also maintaining his former boss sign off the hush money payment at the heart of the trial. And despite Trump's pretrial claim that he would absolutely positively testify in this case, it looks like this case is wrapping up starting tomorrow with closing arguments without the testimony of Donald Trump. President Joe Biden announced as outrageous the International Criminal Court's announcement today that it is seeking to arrest Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders and charge them with war crimes and crimes against humanity. And the Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, that is, who's been in the news a great deal, now we know, has sold shares of beer giant Anheuser-Busch as conservatives were ditching the Bud Light brewer over its partnership with a transgender social media influencer. On the same day Alito sold Anheuser-Busch, he then bought the same amount of stock in Molson Coors, a company with a history of facing political boycotts. And the California Assembly on Thursday of last week voted to issue an official apology for the state's role in slavery and the systemic racism that ensued. But other bills meant to offer reparations in the state of California died shortly afterward in the Senate. The apology is a bill authored by Assemblymember Reggie Jones Sawyer that accepts responsibility for all the harms and atrocities committed by the state and is part of a hard-fought legislative package for reparations for descendants of African Americans who were enslaved. This is the news, and this is Areva Martin in real time, and I'm your host, Areva Martin. This is your one-stop destination for today's trending news, expert analysis, and my unfiltered opinions. I am back in the hot seat this week and going forward. I was so grateful to have Robert Battles, my producer and a guest host, fill in for me last week. I was off at Columbia University attending the graduations for my two daughters. But it's good to be back and joining you, particularly in hour two, because one of my good friends, Dr. David Eichhardt, is going to be here as we try to make sense of this new report that's out that says that 1 in 3 Americans, 1 in 3, say that Black people aren't better off because of integration. Say that even though Brown v. Board of Education decided 70 years ago was supposed to desegregate schools, some studies say that schools are as segregated today as they were prior to Brown. And a lot of folks say that, so what? We had whatever level of desegregation that did occur, whatever level of integration occurred with Black and white students, that Black folks are not better off. Today, about half of Black adults favor letting children attend neighborhood schools, even if it means most students would be of the same race, which, given the way housing patterns are in this country, it absolutely positively means that if you go to your neighborhood school, chances are you're going to go to an all-Black school or an all-white school, because our neighborhoods are as segregated today as they have been in decades gone by. Now, white Americans also sometimes hold conflicting views. So according to a study, 9 in 10 whites say they support the Brown decision, and nearly 2 in 3 say more needs to be done to integrate schools throughout the nation. Now, but nonetheless, large segments of the white population oppose strategies that would help make that integration a reality. Nearly 8 in 10 whites say it's better for children to go to neighborhood schools over diversifying them. So there's a lot of conflicting information in these polls, because on one hand, white folks are saying, yes, they believe that integration is important and that schools should be integrated. But on the other hand, they say that kids should go to school in their own neighborhoods, recognizing that if you keep kids in their same neighborhoods, they are likely to go to all or single race schools, all black or all white. Now, the Brown decision, really spoke to this ideal nation, notion, this ideal notion that we were going to somehow be integrated, that blacks and whites, if they went to school together, that it would also cause there to be integration in housing and parity and equity in the workplace. And we know that most of those notions, most of those concepts have not been realized in this country today. So Dr. Eichhardt is going to help us make sense of this Brown decision issued 70 years ago on Friday. It was the 70th anniversary. And we talk fondly about Brown v. Board of Education. And in law school, when you take a constitutional law class, you spend a lot of time on Brown v. Board of Education. President Biden marked the anniversary of the Brown decision last Thursday. He had a meeting with some of the surviving plaintiffs, those individuals who were actually a part of the lawsuit, and their families. The lawsuits are about 5 lawsuits that got consolidated into the Brown v. Board decision, or into that case. And then on Friday, Biden addressed the NAACP at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, marking again this milestone. So there's lots of celebrations happening on Thursday and Friday to celebrate the anniversary of Brown v. Board of Education. But the reality of where we are in this country after Brown is pretty dismal. And Dr. Eichhardt is going to help us find some hope in some of these startling statistics. So stay with us when we come forward. Dr. David Eichhardt and the Brown v. Board of Education decision right here on KBLA Talk 1580.
You're listening to Areva Martin in real time on KBLA Talk 1580.
Hi, it's Tavis Smiley. First, thank you for your support of KBLA Talk 1580. We deeply appreciate you. So, I get asked all the time, Tavis, when are you going to bring back that State of the Black Union Symposium you used to do? You know, the one where you had all those black intellectuals on stage every year and everybody watched all day live on C-SPAN. Yeah, I know the one. Let's bring them back. Well, I am pleased to tell you that if you go to KBLA1580.com right now, you can sign up to be in the audience here in Los Angeles when we go back live on C-SPAN with a stage full of black thinkers and influencers for a historic conversation. America has never seen a stage full of black folk talking about the urgency of now. Climate justice, climate equity, climate resilience. It's going down Tuesday, June 18th, 4 to 7 p.m. at the California Science Center in Exposition Park. Admission is free, but you must register at KBLA1580.com. Once we reach capacity, you'll have to watch us on C-SPAN. But if you want to be in the room when we go live from Los Angeles, Tuesday, June 18th, head to KBLA1580.com right now to reserve your seat. Caring about the climate, caring about the community. With KBLA Talk 1580, we've got your black. I believe up there. Hey!
Environmental justice is racial justice.
Environmental justice is social justice.
This is KBLA Talk 1580.
Girl, I have a secret. When I get stressed out, I get sweaty. That's why I use Secret Clinical Antiperspirant. It's like my own secret weapon. For 72 hours, I get Secret's strongest protection against sweat caused by stress, heat, and activity, because you know how crazy life can get. Plus, it's made with advanced odor fighters that don't just cover up smelliness. They help prevent it from happening in the first place. Believe me, if I weren't wearing Secret, I'd be a hot, smelly mess. Thankfully, Secret works.
So you just used bug spray in your home. Now what? Well, between the waiting and waiting for things to dry up and keeping your family away from the mess, it hits you. You could have used Zevo. Unlike other bug sprays that stick around, Zevo goes from kill to clean in seconds. Plus, it's safe for use around people and pets when used as directed. Zevo, people-friendly, bug-deadly.
Substance use disorder and addiction is so isolating. And so, as a Black woman in recovery, hope must be loud. It grows louder when you ask for help and you're vulnerable. It is the thread that lets you know that no matter what happens, you will be okay.
When we learn the power of hope, recovery is possible. Find out how at startwithhope.com. Brought to you by the National Council for Mental Wellbeing, Shatterproof, and the...
We are back, and Professor David Eichhardt, professor of African American Studies at Vanderbilt University, is joining me in this hour, and we're talking about the Brown versus Board of Education landmark decision by the U.S. Supreme Court that was supposed to desegregate public schools. I want to read something, Professor Eichhardt, that's written in a Washington Post article about the decision. It says the Brown decision was deeply polarizing, with massive resistance in the segregated South, where federal troops were at times required to escort Black students into what had been all-white schools, and violence in the North, too, as some white parents angrily protested busing orders that federal courts began issuing in the 1970s. Shortly after the 1954 ruling, a Gallup poll found 55% of Americans approved of Brown, while 40% disapproved. But it succeeded in diversifying schools, with segregation rates falling through the 1970s and 80s. Integration peaked around 1988. Then courts began lifting their orders, and segregation began to rise again. The majority of Americans wrongly believe that schools are less racially segregated today than 30 years ago. A post Ipsos poll finds, in fact, by multiple measures, schools are more segregated today than they were 30 years ago. That is a startling statistic and reality. Professor Eichhardt, help us understand, how can it be that schools, public schools, are more segregated today than they were 30 years ago?
Well, first of all, let me thank you again for welcoming me back to the show. It's always a pleasure to dig into these really, really pressing questions of the day that affect all Americans, right? We talk about these as Black issues, but these are American issues, right? First and foremost, the initial case in terms of the Brown case was really about making good on the initial promise of the Jim Crow system, right? And the Jim Crow system was based on this idea of separate but equal, right? So the idea was somehow, okay, people can be in separate schools, but still in separate spaces and different water fountains and bathrooms, but they still have equality. What actually came to pass in reality was something dramatically different, which is to say, as we all know, the Jim Crow system, Black people had inferior schools, had inferior facilities. People were actually rendered as second-class citizens in those particular spaces. And so when that original case was coming out of actual South Carolina, the idea was to hold the feet to the fire of those that Jim Crow system and actually have those schools funded, right? Have those resources equally distributed to the Black students. Well, what ultimately ended up happening was desegregation got shot down by the Supreme Court. Of course, it was argued famously by Thurgood Marshall. What happened next, though, shocked both Thurgood Marshall and also Derek Bell, right, who also worked on the case. For those of who don't know, Derek Bell is author of Critical Race Theory. And they thought this was going to be such a landmark case because it was going to force society to be equal. Black people were going to have access to all these resources, including universities that were white only. only to find out, as Derek Bell actually wrote in his book, and I'm blanking on the name of this book. You'll probably remember it, Areva. But in this book, he talked about the failure of the actual Brown legislation because they didn't anticipate how crafty the states would be in denying full access to those Black students. And so what happened, some states, like I think it was either Mississippi or Louisiana, shut down the public schools, created a fund with state monies to send to the white students to these schools. So for at least, I think it was 2 or 3 years, Black students in those states could not even have access to public education, right? And they kept doing these types of jujitsu dynamics within the legal system. So it took, in some cases, almost another decade and a half before states like Mississippi and Louisiana actually desegregated. And then by the time that it came to them being desegregated, when they realized that that dynamic was inevitable, you had an explosion of private schools. Many of these schools were also funded by state monies. Right now, to this day, we actually have more private schools. People don't realize we actually have more private schools in America than we do public schools, and by a large number. And all of that can be traced to the Brown decision, and particularly about a little over a decade afterwards, where it became inevitable that we were going to have a desegregated society.
So, Professor Eichert, obviously, you just mentioned two of the brightest legal minds, in our, recent history, our memory. Probably the greatest legal minds ever when you talk about African Americans, Derek Bell and Justice Thurgood Marshall, who was, before a justice, was actually head of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. So these were smart people. And Derek Bell was a professor at Harvard for many years. Yes, I think his book you're talking about is Race, Racism, and American Law.
Yeah.
Did they not make the association between schools and housing? Because the reason busing that needed to take place in the South and in the North was because to integrate the schools meant we had to somehow mix the kids in different neighborhoods, because all the Black people lived in one neighborhood and all the white people lived in a different neighborhood. And if they went to their neighborhood schools, by definition, those neighborhood schools would have a single race of students at them. So in order to get Blacks and whites to go to school together, you had to bus either the white kids to the Black neighborhoods or the Black kids to the white neighborhood.
Right.
But was there any thought given by any of these leaders at the time about the fact that the neighborhoods were as segregated as the schools, and just by putting the kid on a bus to leave from one part of town to get to the other part of the town was in the long run not likely to be an effective method of integration because the neighborhoods were so segregated? Can you recall, I mean, you're a history professor, do you know if that part of the conversation was a focus on that?
That we have to remember, right, that white supremacy has been baked into this system, right? So even as you had that ruling, and even as, again, like I said, it took over a decade for most of these states to actually adapt this type of desegregation. And by then, a lot of these private schools had been firmly, ensconced informed into the system, right? But the thing that happened in the actual implementation of it, right? There's one thing to have the laws and all the pressure, but when you actually implement it, what did that actually look like? Well, what it looked like was they shut down most of the Black schools, right? Forcing the Black students to go to the white schools. And that's crucial because you didn't have white students that were somehow going to these Black schools. First and foremost, that wasn't going to happen in that era. You were not going to have white kids that were going to go to majority Black schools because they were Black. Also, the buildings, the resources also were clearly very inferior. So the implementation of the desegregation always already created the combustible, right, situation that meant that the dynamic of desegregation was always wrought with conflicts and racial tension. right? So much so that you had like, states in Louisiana, Mississippi that literally said like, look, we'll succeed from the Union. Like, you're going to have to come down here with military forces if you expect. I mean, we know Ruby Bridges, right? Little Rock Nine. We know the stories, right? Where literally you had to bring in federal forces to make these states desegregate their schools, right? And again, in some of these cases, that was over a decade after the Brown decision.
I guess understanding that,
Right.
and again, understanding the white supremacy, and the fact that you just said that white students were not going to come into black
No.
neighborhoods and black schools.
No.
But still, I guess I'm just trying to understand, were the leaders in that moment, those legal minds, those sociologists, those educators, did they anticipate that we would be where we are today,
Right.
where schools are as segregated today as they were 30 years ago, because our housing was segregated at the time that they're trying to enforce the Brown decision? You had black neighborhoods, you had white neighborhoods. And just like you said, white families weren't going to send their kids to black schools. White families did not want black families living in their neighborhoods. Because one way you could integrate the schools is if we had integrated communities. So if I didn't live in an all black neighborhood, if I lived in an integrated community, that school in the neighborhood would by definition be integrated. So I'm just trying to understand the thinking. Was this outside the realm of the thinking of those thought leaders and those, folks who were moving the civil rights agenda at that time? I mean, there was a lot to do, right? There was housing discrimination, there was employment discrimination, there's education. I mean, there was, you name it, it was there. So I'm not trying to criticize as much as I'm just trying to understand.
Well, I mean, back to one of your mentors, right? Derek Bell. When he writes in his book on the Brown decision, he talks about how at that moment where they won the decision, there was widespread celebration. There was widespread excitement because they thought, hey, this went all the way to the Supreme Court. This is now the law of the land. Individual states cannot deny people access to these schools because it's now federal law. And so Derek Bell was like, we thought this was going to be a radically socially transformative decision, and this was going to change everything. And then he writes that he didn't anticipate how absolutely cynical, cruel, and manipulative these states and state government and even federal governments were, so that it quickly became apparent that a lot of these states were not going to desegregate their schools. They were not going to desegregate dynamics of housing. They were not going to immediately get rid of the Jim Crow dynamics. And I think Black people have historically been optimistic, even when we haven't had a whole lot of reason to be optimistic. And then when you start talking about housing, you have to remember that the reason why we needed a actual federal housing legislation was because even when the federal government interceded to start giving these 30-year fixed loans that most people use today to buy houses, even when those acts were passed so that people could access those funds and that the regular person could actually buy a house, right? Because prior to that, only really wealthy and well-to-do people could buy houses because a bank was only going to loan you money for a couple of years, right? So when the federal government intervened and they actually backed up these loans so that people could actually take out these longer-term loans, the average person actually had access to the housing. But what happened was a lot of these states implemented additional laws to make it difficult for Black people to access those funds, dividing up various areas by these kind of color codes that put Black people in areas that were undesirable. And if you were in an undesirable area, you could not get a federal housing loan. And if you moved into one of these white neighborhoods right? You were literally harassed. In some cases, people were killed and run out of these neighborhoods, right? Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote famously about this dynamic of housing. So the housing and the schooling were intimately entwined in that way. And I think, again, people like Derek Bell, one of the greatest minds, right, legal minds of the 21st century, were very optimistic. They thought this actually legal dynamic was going to have a seismic change. In fact, it proved not to be nearly as significant as he had initially hoped.
When we come forward, Dr. Eichhardt, I want to talk about this contradiction. White Americans who say they believe that integration is important, but who are adamantly opposed to integration when it comes to housing, such as low-income housing or even affordable housing being built in their neighborhoods. What does this mean for the prospect of ever having an integrated public school system? Stay with us, KBLA Talk 1580.
More of Areva Martin in real time when we come forward.
I'm Doug Davis. Here's the latest from the Black Information Network. Ex-Trump lawyer Michael Cohen is admitting he stole $30,000 from the Trump Organization. Cohen made the admission while on the stand today in Trump's hush money case in New York City. In Chicago, one person is dead, 27 are injured following a string of shootings that occurred from late Saturday night through Sunday morning. A 12-year-old boy was shot riding his bike. President Joe Biden is coming to Los Angeles. Biden will be joined by former President Barack Obama for a fundraising event on June 15th. The exact location of the fundraiser has yet to be announced. And today in U.S. history, in 2009, NFL quarterback Michael Vick was released from federal prison after serving 21 months of a 23-month sentence in connection with a dogfighting ring. And that is the latest. I'm Doug Davis from the Black Information Network and BINnews.com. Stay safe out there. Have a great Monday.
Back in Baldwin Park, left lane is still blocked with an accident on the 10 East before Francisquito Avenue, La Puente split. And right now, heavy traffic continues from Peck Road. Back downtown on the 110 South at the 101, a hit-and-run accident has been reported on the right shoulder with heavy traffic forming from Sunset Boulevard. Long Beach's crash has been cleared from lanes of the 91 East at the 710 with a 15-20-minute backup running heavy in recovery from Avalon Boulevard. And if you're in North Hollywood, drive with caution on Magnolia Boulevard East after the 170 Hollywood Freeway interchange as a vehicle is seen on fire in unknown lanes and causing a backup from Colfax Avenue.
Hi, I'm Kyle at Blindster.com. If you're like many people, you may think custom blinds is a job for expensive professionals. Well, at Blindster, if you have a tape measure and a screwdriver, you can install our custom blinds and save big. Plus, we guarantee they'll fit. Blindster.com.
This is the KBLA Sports Minute with Ray Richardson.
The NBA appears to be approaching a new level of parity. The Denver Nuggets Game 7 loss to Minnesota Sunday night means the NBA will not have a repeat champion for the fifth straight year. Over the past 20 years, only two teams have won back-to-back titles, Golden State in 2018 and 2019, and the Lakers in 2009 and 2010. There also appears to be a changing of the guard and star power in the NBA postseason. Denver's loss sent Nikola Jokic home. Jokic was the last remaining MVP among active players still competing in the playoffs. Check out this list of active NBA players who have won an MVP but are at home watching the playoffs. LeBron, Russell Westbrook, James Harden, Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, Joel Embiid, Giannis Antetokounmpo, and Derrick Rose. The Angels are back in action tonight at Houston. A win puts the Angels at 500 on the road. The Dodgers are at home against Arizona. No debates, no speculation, just the info you need. That's your KBLA Sports Minute. I'm Ray Richardson on KBLA Talk 1580.
Follow the leader. KBLA Talk 1580. Follow the leader.
If you're not following KBLA Talk 1580 on all of our socials, then you're missing out. Download our app and find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and on the web at KBLA 1580.
That's right.
Again, you can find all of our socials at KBLA 1580.
We've got a lot to talk about.
By the way, if you miss any of our weekday shows in real time, you can always catch up by checking out the podcasts of your favorite shows at your leisure. At KBLA Talk 1580, we've got your black.
Got your black.
Keep
following the leader. Oh my God. Follow the leader. Follow the leader. Follow the leader.
We asked seniors how to prevent Medicare scams. My best advice, if you get a phone call, do not talk to the person. These people are well trained. Don't talk to them.
They don't know me. They're just trying to scam me.
Don't be fooled. Hang up. Just hang up.
Never give out your Medicare number.
They're going to get your number to put in a false claim.
If I get a call from someone, I don't pick up the phone. And should I pick up the phone and they ask for information, then I hang up.
How do you detect Medicare fraud?
Just like I check my credit card statements, I check my Medicare statements monthly.
Scammers can get a hold of your number, order medical devices through your account, and you're not even going to know about it if you don't look at your statement.
Check your statement every month.
If you get your statement and you see something that you know you did not have done, you report it.
Call your senior Medicare Patrol.
To report Medicare fraud, call the Senior Medicare Patrol at 855-613-7080.
Yeah. The California Crusader newspaper would like to thank all of our subscribers for their support throughout the years, proudly serving the South Los Angeles and South Bay areas for more than 40 years. The California Crusader is a multicultural, Black-owned, adjudicated newspaper that focuses on providing newsworthy information to the people in our community. We're constantly looking for ways to assist businesses in our community to connect with our subscribers. We provide low-cost, effective ways to promote your business with our reasonable and affordable advertising rates. You can participate by suggesting, sharing, and submitting your stories on the California Crusader newspaper Community Share Facebook group page, or visit our website at cal-cruise-news.com. That's calcruisenews.com. Then click on the Submit Now button located on the top right corner of the homepage, or text CCN to 42828. Again, text CCN to 42828. The California Crusader newspaper, working together to build a better community for our future. Subscribe today.
This is KBLA Talk 1580. Talk radio that's music to your ears. We're unapologetically progressive. KBLA Talk 1580.
We are back, and we're talking to Professor David Eichart from Vanderbilt University about the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. Yes, it has been 70 years since the Supreme Court issued a ruling to desegregate public schools across this country. Dr. Eichart has reminded us it took another 10 years before many states even took any of the actions necessary to desegregate schools. And now, 70 years later, 1 in 3 African Americans say that desegregation did not help Black folks. So, Dr. Eichart, help us understand, again, when you talk about desegregating schools, we've already talked about the fact that housing still remained very segregated in this country and still does today. But the fact that 1 in 3 Black people say that didn't help me at all, why do you think that is?
Well, you have to remember that, one of the reasons we call that desegregation dynamic that happened in the 1930s redlining is because when the federal government trying to help basically white families in the 1930s coming out of the Great Depression who were defaulting on their loans, and they created basically this called Homeowners Loan Corporation. And this group of people went around to these various neighborhoods and they created this color coding. And the color coding was designed to label whether or not these areas were credit worthy, right? Whether or not the federal government should back up anybody who's in these areas who gets a loan, right? And green was the best. Purple was still good. Yellow was, definitely needs help. And then red was hazardous, do not fund, right? And guess where most Black people lived, right? And so what happened is, like, being Black and being in these areas meant that literally you were living in the worst conditions, the worst housing, and those areas were not going to be funded. So when a Black person tried to move into a white area, because the literal federal government had conflated being Black in terms of housing as actually risking right, downgrading an area to the point in which they would not get federal funding for their loans, it literally made it so that Black people were actually a liability in these neighborhoods in terms of the quality of life and the ability to be able to get these loans. That's why we have the saying, like, there goes the neighborhood, right? Black people come into the neighborhood, they get conflated with lowering the values and the prices because it was literally baked into the federal government, right? So the same government, right, that supposedly shot down segregation was also the ones that created these systems to ensure white privilege, right? And that dynamic, as we've seen today, right, there was a recent case in which a Black family had valued their home at, I think, $600,000 or $700,000. The bank comes, they were getting a refinance or something on the loan. The bank comes and says, no, it's only worth $400,000 or $500,000. And then they had them come back and had one of their white friends actually represent themselves as the owner, and the value of it went up a couple $100,000. Right now, this happened recently, so we see that this dynamic of redlining, this dynamic of depreciation, creating the value of the homes is still very much the case today. Even when you sell a home, right? And I've sold 4 homes. An actual real realtor will tell you, take down anything that marks you culturally as Black. Any pictures of your family, maybe you got Black art, take those things down off your wall because they actually lower the value and the price of your property. I mean, this is in the 21st century. So if that's still the thinking, that's still the dynamic that we're dealing with today, we see how it's like part of the thinking in these types of neighborhoods right outside of Nashville and Nolensville, where we have one of the highest income in terms of household incomes in the state. And it is very difficult to get any type of affordable housing in this area because it gets met with a lot of resistance, because even though they won't say Black or they won't say brown, they'll say, well, it's going to bring an element into the community. It's going to bring down our housing values, right? It's going to it's going to make our it's going to increase crime. Is going right. All of these elements, right? We could date that right back to the 1930s, the redlining dynamic, where Black people are literally embodied as a hazard, both in terms of the social dynamic, but also in terms of the values of your home and your property. So this, again, like I said, it is literally baked into the system. And what we know too about Black professionals is that even though you might have a Black person and a white person that makes the same amount of money, Black people tend to live in neighborhoods that are at least 2 tiers below where they are financially. White people tend to live in neighborhoods that are at least 2 tiers higher than they are financially. And why that matters is because when those when those schools are allocated in terms of funding, it's usually based on zip code and property taxes. So of course, the more expensive neighborhoods have the better schools. And if you're a Black person, you got a PhD, you got a degree, whatever, but you're living in a lower economic neighborhood, your child is likely to go to a school that's going to be underfunded and have a whole lot more problems.
So, Dr. Eichart, some of the plaintiffs in the Brown v. Board of Education, like I said, it was a consolidation of about 5 lawsuits. Many of the plaintiffs did not want segregated. They didn't want to desegregate the public schools. They wanted the same level of resources that were being poured into white schools to be poured into Black schools. When we think about, again, Derek Bell, Thurgood Marshall, all of these legal minds, was that the position that they adopted? Were they also arguing for equity in terms of resources, or were they pushing this notion that we needed to integrate the schools?
Well, you have to remember that a lot of these schools, particularly these Black schools, one of the advantages to these Black schools that they were in the various neighborhoods. So, people didn't have to go great distances to go to those schools. You remember, this was an agrarian society. So a lot of times the kids had to work in the fields and whatever in order to help the household financially. So having a school in your neighborhood was crucial to the financial economic makeup of that community, right? Because a lot of young people had to work, right, in the fields. The second major component to that was that they were Black teachers. These were Black students that were taught by Black students. What we even know statistically today is that Black teachers tend to push students to be excellent, have higher expectations on their students, including their white students. And it has a dramatic effect and impact on their academic success, right? We know, that's the stats that tell us today. So what we saw then in this particular case was you had a lot of folks who were saying, including people like Derek Bell, who were saying that, look, this separate but equal doctrine was based on people having equal resources. And what we're asking at the very least is that you need to fund our schools the way you fund the white schools. You need to give us access to these federal and state resources like you give the white people, the state, the funding for their housing, for their schools, right? That was actually the primary push in that regard. So there was not really this idea, because people are smart. They understood that sending their kids to a school with majority white kids was gonna be an issue, right? But again, white kids were not gonna be bused or not gonna go to these Black schools. It just wasn't gonna happen, right? It didn't happen ever in any case.
So
right?
I'm trying to understand, is it the belief that the Supreme Court got to the integration piece or the desegregate schools as a way to deny Black schools the economic resources? Like, no, I'm not going to give you any money over here to bring this school up to par, but I will let this Black kid over here get on a bus and go over to this white school. I'm just trying to understand if the push from the plaintiffs was about not desegregating, but about giving us economic parity, economic resources. How do we get from that? Because that could have been a ruling by the Supreme Court that school districts that fund these schools at a different level, they do so in an unconstitutional fashion, and that all schools have to bring into parity, funding for schools. That could have been one of the ways the Supreme Court approaches. When we come forward, I want to, get you to respond to that, because I'm grappling with, how do we get here? Because obviously it has not worked in a way that anyone, I think, expected or hoped that it would work. And as we move forward, what does that tell us about any kind of notion of the courts trying to force integration? Stay with us, KBLA Talk 1580.
You're listening to Areva Martin in real time on KBLA Talk 1580.
City of Los Angeles landlords, verify your tenant's emergency renters assistance program status today. Tenants approved for rental assistance are protected from eviction for non-payment of rent through May 31st, 2024. Approved rental assistance applications protect tenants from eviction for non-payment of rent. Refusing to accept rental assistance based on their source of income is illegal under law and can be used as a defense in an eviction case. Check your tenant's application status now at housing.lacity.org. That's housing.lacity.org.
This is KBLA Talk 1580, home of the 2024 Climate Justice Campaign.
I have diabetes. I'm at risk for pneumococcal pneumonia.
I have asthma. I'm at risk too.
If you're 19 or older with chronic conditions like asthma, diabetes, COPD, or heart disease, or are 65 or older, you are at increased risk for pneumococcal pneumonia. Ask your doctor or pharmacist about Prevnar 20, pneumococcal 20-valent conjugate vaccine, a Pfizer vaccine that can help protect you against pneumococcal pneumonia in just one dose. Even if you've already been vaccinated with other pneumonia vaccines, Prevnar 20 may help provide added protection. Prevnar 20 is approved for adults to help prevent infections from 20 strains of the bacteria that cause pneumococcal pneumonia. Continued approval may depend on a supportive study. Don't get Prevnar 20 if you've had a severe allergic reaction to the vaccine or its ingredients. Adults with weakened immune systems may have a lower response to the vaccine. Side effects include pain and swelling at the injection site, fatigue, headache, muscle, and joint pain. For full prescribing information, please call 1-855-213-2138 or visit Prevnar20.com.
KBLA Talk 1580. We've got a lot to talk about.
KBLA Talk 1580, connecting you with services and solutions. Single Moms Planet is a nonprofit organization dedicated to uplifting under-resourced single mom business owners and working mothers nationwide. Single Moms Planet offers comprehensive programs of financial literacy, business development, mentorship, and entrepreneurial training. They provide education, accountability, and hope. Single Moms Planet was founded by model, TV personality, and producer Nefertari Plessy. Nefertari felt firsthand the challenges that face single moms as she was raised by a working single mother. She learned that the most disadvantaged group in the United States are single mom families. According to the U.S. Census, 30% live under the poverty line. So she decided to do something about it, along with co-founder Cole Patterson. Their goal is to end the poverty cycle in single mother households through education, opportunity, and networking, providing family and child enrichment programs for under-resourced single-parent families. Single Moms Planet serves over 10,000 single moms and their children each year. Studies show that business development and financial literacy provide a positive environment for children and families, exposing them to new possibilities and opportunities. To attend one of their fun events, make a donation, or get more information, or if you need help as a single mom, please visit singlemomsplanet.org. That's singlemomsplanet.org. This is a community call to action from KBLA Talk 1580.
We are back, and Dr. David Icard is here and helping us. We're talking about the 70th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education case. That was the landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision that was supposed to desegregate our public schools. Now, 70 years later, a new study out in the Washington Post says that schools are as segregated today as they were 30 years ago. And 1 in 3 Black folks say that desegregation did not help Black people. Dr. Icard, given that we haven't made a lot of progress with this, desegregation, and that Black folks don't seem to care that much about it anyhow, where do we go? How do we move forward? You mentioned that there are more private schools now than public schools. Should we have a focus and an energy on trying to desegregate public schools, or should we just acknowledge that it is what it is, and just try to get Black students in the best private schools that they can get into? Should we be pushing for school vouchers? We know that Republicans are big on school vouchers and giving parents federal dollars so they can go into private schools. It just begs the question to me as to where we should be as a community on this issue of education.
Man, that's a hard question. That's a big one, right?
It is.
Right. You always bring so much intensity with these questions, right? I mean, we could certainly. I think
I only ask the hard questions to my smartest guest.
Well, I'll take that.
Only to my smartest guest.
Absolutely. I think first and foremost, desegregation as a philosophy does not work because it's based on things that are sociologically proven to be inaccurate, which is this kind of idea that if you put different kinds of folks in the same room, in the same classroom, it will result in community bonding and what have you. That's just not what bears out in the stats. What we find is that, in fact, in some of the most desegregated schools, most diverse schools, the racism by whites is actually the highest, right? So in other words, putting bodies in similar spaces does not result in, this kind of kumbaya bonding. Beverly Tate wrote a book about that. Why all the white kids sit together in the cafeteria or something like that, where she tracks this particular kind of dynamic of segregationist thinking, right? So because our culture is still very much grounded in white supremacy, right? And white supremacy is grounded in, as Toni Morrison would say, the not me and the not free, right? So in other words, being Black, embodying Black is the opposite of success, is the opposite of access, is the opposite of intellectual and ethical, right? That's baked into the DNA of our culture. And so just putting bodies in classrooms doesn't actually penetrate or explode those internalized cultural dynamics. Now, to the question of like, well, what do we do about that? I think that's a much harder question. I think if this voucher system was designed that with kind of Black people in mind, which we know that it is not, that would not be a bad option for us. But here's how a lot of these voucher systems are designed, right? Let's say you get a voucher in a particular area, and the school that you get the voucher in is 15, 18 miles away. Well, if you socially, economically, if you have a car and the flexibility in your job, it's no big deal for you to drive your child, right, to that school when there's going to be no access to busing, no public transportation, right? So you can just put your child in the car and drive them to school and pick them up. If you are African American, Black, right, you don't have the same kind of access to public transportation, same kind of access to cars and the like, that becomes a significant burden for you. A burden that actually makes it so that your child can't attend that school, right, in that way. So by having those kind of elements as part of the dynamic of those vouchers, it actually hides the ways in which those vouchers actually discriminate based on class and race, right? So that if it was a voucher system in which people could get because busing for Black people is crucial, right? Because it allows your child to get to school, back and forth to school, without you actually having to take the expense or the time in order to do that. Whereas for white kids, it's not as crucial. And so those are the types of things that are problems with vouchers. And also those vouchers in a lot of states, they don't just create the economic dynamic for these kids to go to these private schools. They take that money, right? Those vouchers come from taking that money from the public schools and weakening the public schools, right? So it would be the case that the vouchers, which disproportionately are privileging white people, that would disproportionately advantage the white middle class and educated, are actually depleting the public schools, which the majority of Black people go to. So it becomes a trick bag. I mean, and part of the challenge is that a lot of these schooling systems, these voucher systems, actually are controlled by people who have a deep and abiding investment in actually sending their kids to mostly or all white schools, right? So if we were actually talking about a situation where people were truly, genuinely concerned with raising the level of education, you're having a different conversation, right? So I think for Black people, you know, and again, you know, for somebody like myself, somebody like yourself, these kind of dynamics in terms of the cars and access or whatever become less of an issue. But for the majority of Black people, it is a major issue. And so many of us, because of these particular kind of systems, will get left behind, right? So I don't...
Yeah, so David Bank, go ahead.
No, what were you going to say?
I was just saying, David Banks, you know, he's the chancellor of the New York City schools, which is the largest school district in the country, pretty much agrees with you that just putting a Black person in a chair next to a white person is not going to help that Black person. He believes that Black kids need to go to schools where they are in their neighborhoods, but they need more funding directed to those schools, the high poverty schools serving students of colors, and more opportunities for advanced placement courses, etc. But we know that school funding is, you know, driven by your community. So, you know, you're taxed as a resident of a city. And if you live in a high income neighborhood of that city, your school generally is going to get more funding, more resources, and not to mention how parents come in and play a role, right? So the affluent parents, if the school doesn't have, you know, a computer lab, they just pull all their resources and buy a computer lab.
Right.
So what the school board doesn't do, they fundraise and do that. So that sounds good in theory, just put more money into poverty-stricken schools, but we've been trying that for a while too, and that hasn't worked out too well.
Well, I think part of the problem is that pathologize our children, and we pathologize, right, the curriculum. And so W.E.B. Du Bois said famously, and so's of Black folks, he says, the unasked question that when white people are thinking about Black people and these types of issues, he said the unasked question is, how does it feel to be a problem, right? How does it? And I think when we come at these issues with this kind of deficit thinking, where somehow our kids don't have the capacity to learn, or our kids are not interested in education, or our kids, we need some kind of special hand-holding in order to be successful, it actually belies the reality. The reality is that Black kids perform at a very high level, primarily when there are Black teachers in the classroom. But what we know is that there's a small percentage of Black teachers in the classroom. We're talking about 5 to 7%. So the majority of these students are going to be taught by white teachers, right? And what we see in these school districts is whatever, when we have this kind of this racial disparity where the people who are running the schools, the principal, the teacher, are white. Black students are punished at a higher rate. They're giving in-school suspension. The expectations for their academic excellence is lowered. They're discouraged a lot of times from taking advanced classes, so on and so forth. So when you create a pathologizing system.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Dr. Eichert, we are out of time. Yeah, this is such a big issue, and you're right. I did ask you this giant, huge, difficult question, and being the brilliant professor that you are, you have been answering it. But I got to have you back. We've got to continue this conversation because it's such an interesting conversation. Because a lot of parents are sitting at home figuring out, what to do, and we're going to be voting this year in a presidential election. And this issue of school vouchers and school choice is on the ballot. But we are out of time. Thank you so much, Dr. Eichert. I will definitely have you back for us to continue this conversation. Stay with us. KBLA Talk 1580, Robin Ayers and the Raw Report coming up.